Alrighty, okay, we're back. It's only been 2 days, but somehow I've gained an additional 400 plus subscribers because, this toroidal propeller thing is apparently that big news. So first of all, thank you very much if you've just joined us, and thank you even more if you're still supporting me. Also, thank you to MIT, because technically this wouldn't be happening. I wouldn't be making this video if they didn't release this design for the world to see. Well, semi-released, it's patented, so we'll talk about that later. But yeah, let's get into it. So I feel like I need to make another video about this because things are moving so quickly. But first, let's actually go into the people who have actually printed my design already and started testing it. So you got Blade, he mentioned on the Center Whippers group, and he has a channel called Quad Erit Demonstratum, cool name. He printed the 2-inch size. He ran it on a bench test and actually found that the design actually draws more amps but produces a bit more thrust, so that was interesting. He then put it on his little whoop and was flying around indoor, and even flew outdoor in minus 15 degrees. So, that kind of killed the battery slightly because I think too much amp draw. But he did it, it flies, it works, which is very cool. Vladimir Paravolov, I hope I said that correctly. He scaled up my design, which I only made up to a 4-inch. He scaled it to 5-inch and then mounted it on his 7-inch Apex. And that flew, but it was weird because in angle mode, it was just kind of going like this the whole time. But then in acro mode, it was actually remarkably stable. And indeed, the sound, a little bit deeper. Interesting. And finally, Willet Mod. I think he's probably the first person to do a roll with the toroidal tri-blade at this point, because in his first video, he did, he actually flew in his garden and he did a roll, a barrel roll kind of thing. And then the prop proceeded to explode and then the drone crashed and all the props were broken. So he then made another video with faster print settings, and that somehow yielded better results. And he actually flew a decent amount. He found really odd behavior in that when you turn, he lost thrust. But when he was flying forward, the faster he went, the more upward lift he had, which I can't understand how that makes any sense, but that's what he noticed. So maybe that's something to do with the drag. Maybe the forward flight has slightly less drag, so the motors spin up faster. I don't think it's an aerodynamic thing. I think it's sort of a byproduct of the prop drag because of the poor design. And I will say that my first design, kind of a poor design for reasons. But yeah, so what do I want to change? Well, here's the thing, and this may be difficult to understand. My original design, the blade starts shallow like this at the hub, but then it has to sweep out. And as it sweeps out to become vertical there, it's basically becoming more vertical the further it goes. Now that's an issue, because that means when the blade gets further out and the effective wind speed further away from the hub, because of how rotation works, gets higher, it's actually producing more drag closer to the edge until eventually becomes vertical. So more drag and less lift equals bad, right? So I wanted to make a change to my design which tries to keep the blade shallower for longer until we get to the edge, in which case we have no choice but to go vertical. So enter my latest design, which is already on Thingiverse, links down in the description. Basically, it looks roughly the same, but if you go to the top view, you'll notice that it's a little bit wonky shaped, and it probably needs more work. But if you compare it to my old design, which looks more pretzel-like and more round and more even, the new design is a little bit funny because of the way that I've done this. And the way that I've done this, I will demonstrate by revealing the new profiles and rails that I've actually created for it. So let's just hide that. And if I then go to lower rails, the lower rails look pretty normal. The upper rail looks pretty normal. I had to make a change to that. But I added extra profiles. So basically I offset a plane to kind of the midpoint of the blade or the loop. Someone on YouTube coined that term, bi-loop and tri-loop. I really like that as an idea. So instead of blade, we say loop because they are loops. Anyway, and maybe he didn't coin it, maybe he read a paper and it said it, I'm not sure. But either way, I saw it on YouTube and I really like that. So going into this, you'll notice that, halfway up the loop, I created these extra profiles, which are basically copy pasted from the hub profile, but they're placed further along. That way, if I now reveal the correct upper rail here, that way, from the hub to halfway out towards the edge, the blade profile stays the same, it stays shallow. And that means from the midpoint to the vertical, it's a relatively quick upright before it kind of loops back in. I believe that this will result in less drag on the blade and a little bit more thrust, a little bit more lift. So that is like one of the key changes that I made that you can see now once I actually reintroduce the whole thing. And the only other real improvement that I've done to this design is that I've made it thinner. So I made it thicker in the last one because I was having issues with my slicer. And I was also worried that if we print these out of FDM too thinly, they'll be more fragile. Well, I've kind of thrown that out the door because if we're going to get this working properly, then we need to get our print settings good. We need to print with better methods, maybe SLA, maybe SLS. You know, if you've got a laser sintering thing, go for that. But keep it as thin as possible. And, you know, we got to find out what flight profile works the best before we get to a later stage like manufacturing. But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so that's kind of this design. I've made improvements on my format, so I've kept the blades and the hub separate. That way I can pump out more designs. And I've even done this 2-inch as a preliminary, but I noticed when I made the 2-inch that actually, because it's scaling off the original 5-inch design, it's made the blades much, much thinner. And that is potentially an issue. So I think I'm going to have to make a new template in order to produce the smaller sizes. So let's say for 4-inch up to 7-inch, I'll just use the 5-inch template, and then maybe I'll make like a 3-inch template, which I'll then use to scale for the smaller sizes. That's something I think I'll do if I have the time, but who knows, I might not have the time. The next interesting thing that I'd like to demonstrate is the bi-blade design. Now, I didn't originally want to do the bi-blade because actually the tri-blade or tri-loop design seems more suited to indoor flying and like cinewhoops, which is kind of why I liked it. It looks less slicey as well because it's more rounded, whereas the bi-blade, even though the tip is not sharp like traditional props, it's still a little bit more wacky. Like it might whack you. Well, it'll hurt more than a tri-blade, definitely. But I concede it's probably the more efficient design, purely because even in regular prop worlds, you know, long-range drones quite often fly with bi-blades. They are more efficient, they are quieter, and if you want, you know, long flight times and smooth cruising, the bi-blade is what you go for. So I suspect the bi-blade or the bi-loop toroidal design is going to be the one to go for in terms of actual efficiency, so I have to make it. But just to highlight how fast things are going, there's a guy named Sasha Kellner on Facebook who actually replied to one of my things, and he'd already printed a bi-blade design. And his design is very, very similar looking to the MIT one in that it has a bit more of a teardrop shape, whereas you'll notice mine actually looks a bit more symmetrical. It's more of an oval. I don't know which one's going to work better. Probably the MIT one. Like I said, we've got to try different shapes to be able to work out what's actually going to work the best before we get to a stage like manufacturing, which I'll get into later. Anyway, so how did I design this one? Well, this one was done pretty much in the same way as the other. So I have, you know, a couple of different hubs set up. But if we look at the profile, let's first look at this profile because I've done this on purpose. I don't want the blades to actually end up hitting each other when they rejoin the hub. So what I've done, I've actually created 2 blade profiles, and the front one is the real blade. The rear one is the imaginary blade of the opposite side. And so I then, you know, duplicate it both ways like this. We have the exact same shape at the end for the edge, and then we just do the rails. In this case, I used an ellipse, which is basically a circle, but it can be like oval shaped, so we can squeeze it. And I used that, and the total width of the whole thing, I basically set it to be about 1/3 of the diameter of the whole prop. And so I then add the profiles like so. Again, same way that I did the tri-blade with the mid profiles to keep the blade angle shallow. And then finally the top rail, and then we pump it out and we get that. Then we rotate it to the other side, build the whole thing, job done. The more interesting thing about this design actually is you'll notice if we look at the profile from the side, I've made the hub profile a little bit steeper than, for example, the side profile, which is a bit more like a real prop. Because if you look at standard prop design, what they normally do is they make the blade profile at the hub steeper, because the hub is effectively, there's less airspeed here, so you can make it steeper. But as you come further out on the prop edge, it then becomes shallower and shallower and shallower. So My bi-blade design ends up sort of accidentally doing this a bit more than the tri-blade design, which, you know, maybe that's going to be a good thing, but that remains to be seen. Anyway, so I'll turn all of these off and we'll just admire the bi-blade or the bi-loop design for a moment. So yeah, materials for printing. I actually like the idea of using TPU for the tri-blade or the tri-loop design because the tri-loop I preferred for a number of reasons. It's less sharp in terms of like, if you hit something, I think it's more likely to glance off. But also because the blades come back into themselves, there's actually more support there. So whilst a standard blade made of TPU would probably flail around with the drag and everything, these might actually fare better because of the fact that they come back into themselves and they're self-supporting. So they might be quite viable in the TPU format, in which case indoor flying might actually become safer because not only will the blade not cut you, the blade might actually just bounce off you. But going back to materials, you know, polycarbonate, you know, a lot of the big manufacturers are manufacturing with polycarbonate, which is really effective. And so, you know, if we get to that stage, polycarbonate probably is the best way. In terms of printing in polycarbonate, I'm not entirely sure. It might be explodey because of the FDM nature. It might not be, but if anybody wants to test that, please do. The other thing is printing methods. So if you're printing in resin, you'll get a smoother surface, but then it's more brittle unless you print with flexible resin, but I have no idea how that behaves. And then of course, if you've got a laser sintering thing, so you can do nylon laser sintering, that would also produce really good results because then you don't need to worry about supports. But, you know, nylon is also kind of fragile in that regard. Anyway, final things. Actual manufacturing. So here's an issue. MIT have a patent or patent on this design. And so people actually manufacturing the final thing would have to get a license from them. They'd have to get permission, right? So that's one issue. The other issue is we don't yet know if this is what we want. You know, a lot of the acro guys are kind of like, oh, nothing's going to replace our regular props, and they're probably correct at this point. But for everybody else, you know, it's always been about weighing the pros and cons. You know, there was a lot of discussion regarding ducts and proper duct design and blade clearance, and now you see most of the Cinewhoops out there have prop guards, and some people are just flying with cages. They've kind of, you know, ducts have gone by the wayside. So I dare say that this design might end up going by the wayside as well. But the whole point of why I released the design early for people to try out is that mass prototyping is probably going to be the best way for us to get to that result. And some people that enjoy this stuff will have fun doing it. I know that I do, which is why it's annoying that I can't print it because I'm not home yet. So that's about it. There's links to my designs down below. So if you want to check it out, I'm going to be adding more later after I've uploaded this video. But tomorrow I'm riding a motorcycle down to Bangkok. So basically I'm not going to be able to work on this maybe for another week or so, at least until I get back to Phuket. So have fun and do let me know. I'll try to answer questions and maybe make changes when I'm on the road. Anyway, that's about it. Thanks once again if you've recently subscribed, and please consider subscribing if you're new to the channel or you dig what I'm doing. Like and comment down below. All the information you need is in the description. And that's about it. I guess I'll see you guys in maybe a couple weeks. Cheers.